My name is Kevin Ryan, and currently technical services engineer for a healthcare company. I live in Indiana, and I was previously a division manager for environmental health laboratories, a division of underwriters laboratories, also in Indiana. I have a degree in chemistry from Indiana University, and I have a certification in quality engineering, which is very closely related to standards in the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I was a laboratory manager at UL for years, so I know about testing samples to national standards. Primarily my involvement, though, is being given information, both verbally and in writing, about UL's involvement. Also seeing the importance of the issue, and then putting those two things into questions back to my upper management and what we were doing as a company to respond to the official story. But I think to some extent I was fooled by the official story as much as anyone, and I had to admit to myself at one point that I was wrong. That was in 2003. 2 years before that, right after 9/11, is when the chief executive officer of my company, Underwriters Laboratories, had told the staff that UL had tested the steel, had actually certified the steel, he said, used to build the World Trade Center towers. And found out that the steel evidence had been destroyed from the buildings. That related quite directly to the statements made by our chief executive officer that we had tested steel for fire resistance, and yet the steel had been destroyed, which the evidence would have told us what had actually happened. I first sent a formal question to our chief executive officer at Underwriters Laboratories in 2003, in late 2003. And I laid these concerns out to him. I said, look, you told us that we tested the steel or certified the steel. This steel has been destroyed. There's alternative explanations for what happened. And he responded a month later. He did confirm that UL had tested the steel used in the World Trade Center buildings with quite a number of statements that I have in writing. Clearly, this chief executive officer, who was a Harvard-trained lawyer, by the way, not an engineer, had fully accepted the official story and had been given information himself about testing done 40 years ago by our company to certify the steel in the World Trade Center buildings. And he shared that both verbally and in writing with staff at UL. When he wrote to me, he copied several top executives who all have this in writing right now. And but he asked me to be patient, wait for the report from NIST, because UL was working closely with them to try and figure out what happened, and eventually there would be an explanation. And I did wait for another year, and the report came out. It included a great deal of contradictory information. They had done physical tests, both at UL and at NIST, that showed that the steel could not have softened, the floors could not have collapsed. And yet the report was coming out suggesting these things actually did happen. So after a period of about a year, I made a presentation in Chicago where I spelled out the problems with this latest story, official story of collapse, because really the NIST report is one of a string of stories that have been given. The kind of a media story was given, Towering Inferno, a FEMA report was given, it was a pancake story, the Silverstein insurance claim was another story. NIST now has had a couple of stories, but this final story is summarized kind of in 7 steps. And if you walk through those and fairly summarize them and look at known facts about the buildings, look at the report within itself to see if it's self-consistent, just look at the story and see if it's realistic. In all 3 cases, you can see that it's not, that it's actually false at every one of those 7 steps. And that's just a collapse initiation sequence. They don't really describe the actual dynamics of the buildings falling. They actually just say, global collapse ensued. And that way they can ignore a whole lot of evidence that points to an alternative hypothesis, like explosions from witnessing explosions or hearing it, demolition squibs coming off the buildings, the speed of collapse, which is a very important piece of evidence. They can ignore all of that by just saying global collapse ensues, period. The biggest problems with that story are the fireproofing being lost, and I show in my lecture that the tests that were done, very weak and humble tests done by NIST, proved that actually the fireproofing could not have been lost in the buildings. There was no energy for it. There was no mechanism for it to occur. That's probably the biggest problem, is the idea that the external columns would bow inward, which is primary to the official story. There is absolutely no physical testing to support that. There is no intuitive reasoning behind it. And the only support is from a highly manipulated computer model in which, the temperatures were exaggerated, the fire times were exaggerated, all the fireproofing was stripped off, and the floors were disconnected, so that we've got absolutely no actual conceptual framework in which to see columns being pulled inwards. If the floors are disconnected, there's no force to pull the columns inward. How did it happen? We're talking about a phantom force now in a highly manipulated computer model. And that's what we're basing our future on, and all of these changes we're seeing. So they had test results that disproved what they were saying that happened. There were also comments being made still about jet fuel fires melting steel by experts supporting the official story. So I wrote to NIST and I asked them about their report, and I asked them to please clarify the ideas that are being stated in the media and in their report. And I was fired for writing the letter. I was fired for nothing else but writing this letter. I didn't violate any policies. I had been promoted just earlier that year to the top management position in my division.